Are we ready? Okay. Well, folks, good evening. My name is Mark Broman. I'm the Executive Director of the Wachiska Audubon, and welcome to our February meeting. I want to welcome everyone that's here in person and those of you out there on the internet tonight. I know there's several people told me they weren't going to be able to make it in, but they're going to be watching. So I'm glad that we've got the folks at home too. Wachiska is an independent chapter of National Audubon. We've got 17 counties in southeast Nebraska. We own 9 prairies and have 23 easements. And so that's what we do. Be sure and follow us on our Facebook and website. You can keep up with things we're doing. At this time, I'm going to ask our president, Teresa Pella, if she would like to come up and make a couple announcements that we've got a couple things coming up about the board meeting next week and a few things. So, Teresa.
All right. Thank you, Mark. Can y'all hear me? I can hear myself, so that's good. Okay, so when I'm done, I'm going to turn it over to Doug. One of our board members has an announcement that he'd like to also mention. But anyway, my name's Teresa Pell. I'm the current president of the Wachiska Board. And we have our next board meeting is February 21st. They're always the third Tuesday at 7 p.m. via Zoom. So that is coming up. And then the other thing, I'll just kind of throw it out there and let Mark add too, is our 50th wedding, Wachiska's 50th wedding anniversary celebration is set. We are not wedding. Did I say wedding? Well, it's kind of like a wedding celebration, yes. So 50 years of Wachiska scheduled. Mark your calendars. Sunday, December 3rd. It'll be an afternoon event at Innovation Campus with a celebratory luncheon to celebrate 50 years of birds, prairies, and people of Wachiska. And then following the luncheon, we will have a speaker by the name of Doug Tallamy, who's a national author who has written several books on bringing nature back to your backyard and diversity and how that all fits together. And I think it complements Wachiska's mission. His work complements what we do very well. So we're hoping that it's going to be a great turnout and look. So put it on your calendars. Thank you, Mark.
Thank you, Teresa. I want to mention that we've got the Great Backyard Bird Count coming up February 17th through the 20th, and another event that's coming up next Saturday, February 18th, from 1 to 3 at the Walt Branch Library. We're hosting Bird Encounter with the Lincoln Libraries and Spring Creek Prairie. And the Raptor Recovery, or the Raptor Conservation Alliance, will be bringing some raptors. There'll be kids' activities, games, bird watching, Project Beak, Build a Bird. If you've ever seen that on the computer, that's kind of fun. And music from Jim King. So Jim's going to be providing the kids' music, and it always has a natural theme to it. So anyway, that's, again, February 18th at Walt Branch Library. So I think we've got enough volunteers at this point. We had a lot of people step up. And so if you have a chance, come out, bring the kids or grandkids or whoever, just bring yourself out and check it out. I'm going to just take a minute now and see if there's been any unusual bird sightings. Has anyone had anything unusual at the bird feeders in the last few days? Tim, what do you got?
I'm not real sure about this, but I thought I was going past 70th and Pioneer.
70th and Pioneers.
Busy.
Yeah.
I saw a bald eagle land on the telephone pole.
I saw a bald eagle. That could very well be. Someone told me they were out at Holmes Lake the other day, and I think it was Dave told me that he'd been seeing a couple out there flying around Holmes Lake, and there had been some reports that maybe they were thinking about nesting at Holmes Lake, so maybe it was one of those dipped, because that's pretty close to. Okay. Any other sightings? Yes, Jason.
We've had a northern shrike hanging out in Spring Creek Prairie the last week or so.
Northern shrike at Spring Creek Prairie. That's a good one. Okay, down front here.
Yeah, 2 days ago I saw a very unusual thing. Right outside my window, sitting in a branch, was a hermit thrush.
A hermit thrush.
It was so close, I knew what
Yeah.
it was because I've seen them migrate through eastern Nebraska before, but this time of the year seemed really strange.
Okay. Good one. Okay. Anybody else have one they want to mention or throw out there? Well, we'll go ahead and continue on. Teresa mentioned our 50th anniversary, and we've got that celebration. Remember, it's December 3rd. It's an afternoon event at Innovation Campus, followed up with Doug Tallamy. And she mentioned he's a professor at the Department of Entomology and Wildlife Ecology at the University of Delaware, and he's authored several books, like Teresa mentioned. The last 3 books, Bring Nature Home, The Living Landscape, and Nature's Best Hope. He discusses how wildlife populations are in decline as native plants disappear, and he advocates for homeowners to turn their backyards into conservation corridors. So be sure and put December 3rd on your calendar. He's a very popular author right now, so we're very lucky to get him. We had very limited dates, and that's why we had to push it back to December. We couldn't get him in August, September, November. So don't forget, after tonight's presentation, we'll have coffee. It's half calf, so those of you who don't want to have full calf tonight, going home, we've also got hot cider and treats. And as always, if anyone would like to help volunteer to bring treats, cookies in the future, brownies, something like that, or helping us with cleanup or setup, be sure and let Arliss and I know. We had a couple volunteers graciously tonight, so you don't just have store-bought cookies. You've got some homemade cookies brought in. I know that I think Ross brought some in, and I know Rosemary did, and there may be some others. And I know I brought some store-bought cookies at the last minute too, just in case we had an overflow crowd. A reminder, tonight's presentation and past presentations are available on YouTube. So if you want to see it again, there's something that just was so great tonight, or you want to share it with friends, let them know. But at this time, it's my pleasure to introduce tonight's speaker, Joel Jorgensen. Joel is the non-game bird program manager for the Nebraska Game and Parks Commission. He's the president of the Nebraska Ornithological Union, the state coordinator for the Breeding Bird Survey, and an eBird regional reviewer. Joel grew up in Blair and attended the University of Nebraska-Omaha. He's got a master's degree also. Tonight he's going to talk about a recent uncovered specimen that was thought to be a barnacle goose, and through a stable isotope analysis they did on the feathers, he's going to give us the results of that. Plus, he's also going to give us some updates in the avian world, including some maybe new records in Nebraska. So he's got all kinds of good stuff. So Joel's always a good resource when it comes to non-game. Remember, non-game is everything except the pheasants and quail and chuckers and the things that you can hunt with a permit. So anyway, so thanks for joining us tonight, Joel, and he'll take questions after the presentation. And so please help welcome Joel Jorgensen.
Thank you very much. It's good to be back here at Wachiska. I think it was before the pandemic came around. That's right. Thank you. I forgot it was even on me. So yeah, it's good to be back at Wachiska. The last time I was here was before the pandemic, and Ross Silcock and I were here talking about our project, The Birds of Nebraska Online. And what I'm going to talk about tonight kind of falls in the same category in some ways because it's about Nebraska birds. And tonight I'm going to be talking primarily about rare birds and how rare birds and whether we accept records or not affects our overall state list. It's something we're very interested in, people like me and others, well, many in this room. And Mark did me a favor by kind of making a point I want to make, is that rare birds are very interesting. We get excited about rare birds. You often tell your friends about what rare birds you might be seeing. And in some ways, they're the celebrities of sort of our birding world. In some regards, they're maybe less important than the common birds that we have, and maybe even the declining regular species that we have in the state. I used to have a professor who, when we talked about rare birds, one that might occur once in a blue moon, that bird had got worms in its brains and doesn't know what it's doing. And that may kind of be accurate sometimes. But more often than not, a rare bird occurring somewhere there's oftentimes a bigger story behind it. Whether there's a trend occurring elsewhere, usually birds just don't show up randomly somewhere. Like I said, there's usually some bigger story behind it. So I'm using the mouse. So again, I'm kind of talking about this through rare birds through the lens of our state bird list. So our state bird list, we have a very robust state bird list of 467 species. A very good number for a landlocked state. Our official state list is maintained by the Nebraska Ornithologists Union. There's actually a standing committee called the Records Committee that votes on records of rare birds to make sure that the identification is correct, evaluates the supporting evidence, and to make sure, the bird didn't escape from someone's bird cage. Sort of to make sure that it's a wild bird naturally occurring, and it made it to our airspace or our grounds legitimately. But our state bird list is not static, of course. We add birds, we add rare birds occasionally. It doesn't happen very frequently anymore, but it still does. And I'm going to touch upon some of those birds that have recently made it to Nebraska a little bit later on. That's the emerging trends part of the talk. But we can also maybe alter our state bird list by digging into the historical record. And that's something I really like doing. There's a lot of great history. And one lesson that I keep learning over and over again is when you dig into the historical record and you read about conclusions of something, whatever it is. It may not be a particular rare bird. It may be some sort of trend in the birding world. And this can be a generalization about lots of things. But you can see how certain things get into literature and then they get perpetuated over and over again. And the same thing is said about something. But when you do the deep dive and play detective, more often than not, you come out the other end with sort of showing that those conclusions that have been out there for a long time may not hold up. They may be incorrect. And that's a lesson, again, I keep learning over and over again that it's worthwhile to sometimes go back and do some digging and play detective. And that's where I'm going to start out tonight, talking about one example that I recently got involved with. Sort of fortunately, it was a lot of luck that this happened, but it really ended up to be a fun little side project. It was a side project, but it was really quite a little adventure. Oh, there I got the... So let's all go back to the year 1968, a year that changed the world, right? Very tumultuous times, great movies like Funny Girl. I wasn't born yet, but a couple people in here might have, but it was a year that changed the world, right? Well, it was also a year that changed Nebraska ornithology in a very small way. But again, this is my point I'm making. So there was a gentleman by the name of Milton Muncy that was hunting in Otoe County. And he shot a bird out of a flock of geese that ended up being this specimen on the right. It was recognized immediately that this was an unusual bird. It was identified as a barnacle goose. And fortunately, someone took a picture of this mount and wrote a little article about it. And if you're not familiar with barnacle geese, they're a Eurasian species breeding in Greenland, the Arctic islands of Eurasia, northern Russia, and they migrate in winter in northern Europe. So not a species we typically see around these parts. So this was a significant record, a very significant record, a big-time rare bird, what we would call a mega rarity, right? So again, it was shot in November. It was reported to be a juvenile bird. It was harvested with a flock of what we call cackling geese now. At that time, cackling geese were part of the Canada goose. The split hadn't occurred by then. It was reported as the first state record, but also a very significant record not only for Nebraska, but also the interior and the western U.S. Potentially the first record of a barnacle goose in a large swath of North America. So a very significant record. However, whenever you're dealing with vagrant waterfowl, there's a question of provenance. And people on records committees that evaluate rare bird records have generally taken a precautionary approach when it comes to accepting records as valid. There's the tendency to suspect that the bird could be a escapee from a captive flock. And if you go to zoos, if you go to some private collections, waterfowl are kept in captivity in North America, and that includes barnacle geese. So it's generally, unless there's evidence to the contrary, it's kind of assumed to be an escapee unless there's a strong case in the other way. And with barnacle geese geese specifically, there was an article in the 1980s in the magazine Birding that really made the strong case that barnacle geese in North America almost certainly had to be escapees from captive flocks. For one thing, barnacle geese are kept in captivity in North America, but also too the wild populations of barnacle geese, the juveniles learn how to migrate with their parents, so the parents know where they're going, juveniles follow them, and so there's not really the opportunity for those birds to sort of stray off and get mixed up elsewhere. Migration in Europe allowed very little room for air, so the birds had to know what they're doing. And then finally, just general weather patterns. If we think about how weather moves across our latitudes from east to west, or west to east, excuse me. I would have undermined my entire point here. Birds trying to fly against the wind, it makes it a little more difficult to get to North America from Europe. So this flavored the thinking for a long time. So barnacle geese in general in North America, they were dismissed as being, like I said, escaped domestic birds. So this record in Nebraska generally was not accepted. There was a project that Tanya Bray and some others did that really evaluated all the rare bird records in the state critically and with a process. They didn't accept this records. The Records Committee, the Nebraska Ornithologists Union Records Committee hadn't accepted this record. So this species does not appear on our official state list. So this ends up being almost like a footnote. And that's a little bit unfortunate because when something becomes a footnote, it kind of becomes forgotten. However, with time, the gentleman, Mr. Riff, who wrote the article about barnacle geese early on, had the information he had, but as time went on, the evidence began to prove that those assumptions and those conclusions incorrect. A barnacle goose banded in one of those Arctic islands that's owned by Norway was shot by hunters in Newfoundland. Another barnacle goose banded in Scotland ended up in Ontario. And then another goose, barnacle goose, in Connecticut was with some Canada geese that were banded in Greenland. So the evidence started to go in the other direction. And Shironi here wrote another article in Birding sort of updating the thinking on barnacle geese, and he laid out the case. Another important thing, I talked about briefly how when rare birds occur somewhere, it's often part of a larger trend. Barnacle geese have been increasing for decades, and not just a little bit, but a lot. Even though our bird was taken in 1968, before a lot of the increase occurred, it was still at a time when this population was increasing. And then also too, if we just look at the distribution of records from North America, if all the barnacle geese in North America are escapees, we would expect the pattern across the calendar to be somewhat uniform. Birds are going to break out of jail any time of the year. There's probably not any specific time when they're going to bust out and get in the wild. If we're dealing with wild birds, we would expect the pattern to follow that more birds are going to be seen in North America during migration periods and during winter. And there's going to be very few observed during the summer. And those in the summer may indeed be escapees. It's not an all or nothing case. It's just maybe a large proportion or some proportion are actually wild birds. And this is the distribution of records from another article showing that you do see a nice pattern of lots of records during migration when you expect it to occur if we're talking about wild birds, and not a nice even pattern of records distributed throughout the calendar year. Also, if we look at the spatial distribution of records, this is from eBird. If we're talking about a bird coming from Europe and Greenland specifically, which would be the most likely source of barnacle geese in North America, we would expect records to be closer to the source. Northeastern North America, and this is in fact the case. So again, the general thinking began to change about barnacle geese, that yes, we do have naturally occurring wild vagrants making it to North America. A lot of Records Committee accepted records, especially those in the Northeast, but even places like Colorado and Arkansas began to accept records. So what does this mean for our specimen in Nebraska? Should we reconsider that? Well, there's a plot twist ahead. So this is where things get a little interesting. So as you know, I work at Game and Parks, and if you've ever been in our side of the building, there's mounts around. And oftentimes, a guy like me that comes in, the mounts have been there for a long, long time. They don't have any information on them, and oftentimes they get dropped off because usually kind of the common scenario is you had a hunter in a family, and he passes away or she passes away, but usually it's a he, and they're dealing with his stuff at the time of his passing, and they need a place to take these specimens, these mounts. And so they call the Game and Parks and, will you take it? And we say, sure, because we like to repurpose things, and sometimes we use those things for education purposes or decorating offices. But when they decorate offices, they kind of become part of the landscape. They kind of become part of the background, the wallpaper. So there was this mount in our office for the longest of times that was just sort of sitting there. And I walked by it. It was kind of in a common area for a while. I now have it in my office, but it was in a common area. I would walk by it from time to time. And I don't know when the switch flipped on, and I made the connection like, hey, that goose kind of looks like that one in that old Nebraska Bird Review article. So I began to look at it. I don't know where it came from. I do now, actually. There's a footnote I can add here at the end. But it did resemble that 1968 specimen. And you probably know where I'm going with this. If we take a closer look, we can actually conclude, yes, these are one and the same. If you look closer, there's the mounts are the same. You notice the little white patch on the neck. That's there. If you look at other details, these are one and the same birds, which is exciting because now we have the opportunity to do something with it, to evaluate the evidence. And so what we did was we did stable isotope analysis. So stable isotope analysis is an interesting process because if you look at in our environment, certain isotope ratios vary across gradients. So the map sort of displays this here, how certain isotope ratios are different in Florida compared to Alaska. So in our project, in our analysis, we used the stable isotope of hydrogen called deuterium. It's a heavy isotope of hydrogen. I think it has an extra neutron or something. And the way organisms acquire this isotope signature is by the food they eat. So a barnacle goose in Florida will have a different stable isotope than one in Alaska. And what is nice about birds is that the isotope signature is locked in feathers. Once they grow the feathers, that isotope ratio is inert. It doesn't change. But what becomes very important if we're trying to determine the origin of the bird, and that's what we were trying to do, is that we need to identify when the bird is growing the feathers. Very critical part, but unfortunately with waterfowl, with geese in particular, we know that a bird in fall certainly grew its feathers in the summer where it spent the summer. Many probably know adult geese undertake a complete wing molt after the breeding season. Our Canada geese around here find a lake during the middle of summer and go spend a few weeks there and replace their feathers. And if it's a young bird, if it's a juvenile, it's naturally going to grow its flight feathers where it was hatched. So we followed the approach in this little study here that kind of was in a similar vein. We don't do stable isotope analysis at Game and Parks, but there are labs that do it. So we sent our feather samples off to a lab in Virginia, a USGS lab. And so I kind of alluded to this just a little bit ago. This is helpful in really nailing down whether our bird is a wild bird or a likely escapee. If our stable isotope signature comes back and suggests it's from a temperate latitude, Nebraska, Kentucky, Ohio, we can conclude pretty safely that bird's probably just an escapee. If it comes back from a northern latitude, the case is very strong that it's going to be, in fact, a wild bird. So I won't leave you hanging too long, but this is a probability map showing where our bird came from. So the darker colors indicates a higher probability. So this does show that, in fact, our bird is of a northern origin. So we can conclude pretty safely, again, along with all the other evidence I presented, that this was a wild bird. So is it time to celebrate that we're adding a new bird to our state list? Well, there's another plot twist ahead. So, is this actually a barnacle goose? It's again, one of these things, it's been in the literature. There was a picture of it for years. I looked at that picture a number of times, but do we need to maybe question the conclusions that were in the literature? Here's a picture of a barnacle goose. Looks very similar. Here's some adult barnacle geese, but if we look a little bit closer, kind of see the back is maybe a little bit darker and not as silvery. The flanks are a little more barred. And if we really begin to look at the head, we see this is where our whole case breaks down. The area between the bill and the eye, much more black. The black is much more extensive. There's black between the eye and the crown. Much more black on the hind neck and the top of the, or the hind neck and the crown. I think I said that. And if we look real close, that shape kind of, this white cheek patch kind of is familiar. And it does resemble our white cheek geese, our cackling geese, and our Canada geese. So, and it was actually, Ross Silcock and Steve Brenner were part of this project, and it was actually Steve, I'll give him credit, who sort of asked that question first. Are we sure this is a barnacle goose? So we had another mystery to solve. What are we dealing with here? So since we have the specimen on hand, we have the measurements. We began to compare the measurements with some other species, or the species that are similar, cackling goose and the appropriate subspecies of Canada goose, because of the direction we were going, and we ultimately concluded that this is in fact a hybrid. It's a hybrid barnacle goose, cackling goose. And if you look at other pictures that are available online, our bird looks very similar to those guys. And this hybrid combination does occur. As we would expect with barnacle goose, those records are distributed closer to the source where we would expect. I mean, closer to the range of the barnacle goose, where things get mixed up with cackling goose. But ours is still a very, very far westerly record. So how would this hybrid happen? The breeding ranges of barnacle goose and cackling goose they don't overlap, they're not sympatric. However, the Arctic is a place where there's not a lot of people, keeping tabs on everything going on up there. So and I think we're pretty well grounded with our suspicions. Cackling geese have been found breeding in Western Greenland, and barnacle geese sometimes get over there. So it's probably somewhere in this area where, a cackling goose and a barnacle goose fell in love, and they produced our guy. And then he migrated south with the flock of cackling geese. Very plausible story. So, is that the end? Well, no, there's one final plot twist. In the original article, this bird was reported as a juvenile. And actually, again, we had the specimen on hand. So looking at the feather wear and the plumage, we determined it was actually an adult bird, an after-hatch year bird. So again, everything that was in the literature about this guy ended up being wrong. It was no longer a juvenile barnacle goose of captive origin. It was a wild hybrid that's an adult. So that's why it was such a fun little project. But this does have implications for our state bird list, because we do have a record of a pink-footed goose. That's another Greenland breeding goose, and very similar sort of story as the barnacle goose. Their numbers have increased as well. There's a number of records from northeastern US, and I think even one from Colorado. And there is a solid record from Nebraska. In January at Harvard Waterfowl Production Area in Clay County, our records committee did not accept this just because out of caution, that there's a possibility it could be an escapee. But I think now that we've established that Eurasian geese, Greenland breeding geese can reach Nebraska, I think it really bolsters the case that this record should be looked at again and probably should be accepted. There's no question about the ID of this one too. Good photographs, and certainly a pink-footed goose with no funny business going on there. So that is sort of the secrets of the dead part of the talk. And so with the rest of it, again, I like going back and looking at historical records, but I also like pondering about what's going on right now. And again, there's a lot of things going on in the bird world. And it's coming at various different angles, and it's sort of like watching the news where you're always trying to make sense of it and synthesize that information to help with the understanding of what's going on in the bird world. So 2022, was also a year that changed the world in a whole lot of ways. So I do the newsletter for the Nebraska Ornithologists Union, and I've sort of got into this routine of doing a top 10 list of the best birds, the rarest of the rare during any one season. And while it's true some birds maybe just appear in Nebraska once in a blue moon, again, I go back to this point that a lot of the birds that are occurring in our state, there's a bigger story going on behind the scene. And so 3 things I want to highlight are 3 birds that appeared on my top 10 list this year. And first and foremost, I think is the limpkin. And maybe some people went up and saw this limpkin, a wading bird that's related to cranes and rails and appears somewhere in between. Karen Cater found one in June at the Worspan Mitigation Wetland in Sarpy County by Worspan Lake, Chaco Hills area. A limpkin, the idea of a limpkin just a few years ago, 5 years ago or so, completely unthinkable, unfathomable. This is a bird you would go to Florida to see. But it's not just one bird showing up in our state. So if we look at eBird records, and I probably should have mentioned this before, the purple are areas where there's reports. The darker the purple, the more reports. So this is all the eBird records, and eBird's a relatively new thing, but people go in and put records from when they were, from the 70s and 60s. It's not a complete database, but it does show the distribution pretty well. That this was a bird in Florida with a little bit of wandering outside the state, but very much restricted to the southeastern United States. But things started to happen. Whoops, did I skip a year? Yep. So this is just a 4-year period. And you can see maybe a little bit of expansion outside of Florida here. A little bit along the coast, the Gulf Coast into Louisiana, a little bit up the Atlantic coast. But then things really started to pick up in 2021. You see more records in Louisiana and Texas, and a record all the way up into Minnesota, Illinois, a couple of records. And then this past year, things just got outright silly. And you can see really a consolidation along the Gulf Coast, records all throughout the Midwest. The same day Nebraska had its first record, or the day the bird was discovered in Nebraska, Iowa also scored its first record. And this is just a level of insanity. So what is going on here? Is is Florida under some drought, and these birds are refugees looking for habitat somewhere, wherever they can find it, or is there some other story? Well, it's actually some other story, and rarely sort of with range expansions or retractions, the explanation is usually not as obvious as this one appears to be. It's associated with an invasive species. Invasive species are generally bad, and that's still true, even though this is an interesting story. But limpkins primarily feed on apple snails, and there's a native apple snail that's primarily restricted to Florida. It's the same apple snail that snail kites feed on, which is another Florida specialty. But this invasive species is becoming established along the Gulf Coast. I don't think limpkins care. We could ask them which one tastes better, but they probably don't. They probably both taste pretty good. So that really appears to be driving the expansion of the limpkin right now. They are breeding. There have been a few observations of breeding in Louisiana and Texas, and that's probably only going to continue. I don't know much about snails, but I know enough I've read enough about giant apple snails to know they don't do well with cold weather. So it's not likely this species is going to move very far north. However, at our latitude, there's sort of a complement of an invasive species, and that's Chinese mystery snails. And you can see the range here. They've spread out throughout the Midwest. And at the Worspan Mitigation Pond, there were lots of Chinese mystery snails. When people first got the word of this limpkin up in Sarpy County, a lot of people rushed up there to see it, which birders do. But there was no reason to rush. That guy was there through the end of October. This is an interesting story, and it's maybe just chapter 2 or something. I think what fascinates me is where is this going to end? Where, in 30, 40 years, where is this going to be at? And one thing that, one thing I also wonder about, and it became a question that a few people asked, limpkins aren't migratory birds really. Are they going to have the wherewithal to migrate south once the weather starts to turn cold? And actually one in Iowa remained until into December when we had that cold blast and eventually succumbed. So, that's part of the story too, is do these birds that aren't used to migrating to temperate latitudes, are they going to have the wherewithal to migrate back south? So the next thing I want to talk about is I highlighted Anna's hummingbirds, but hummingbirds, there's a lot going on in regards to their ranges and populations. Just citing this article, but I highlighted Anna's hummingbird. This was a bird species that we first recorded in the state in 2016. By the end of 2022, we had 8 records, so now we've gone from no records to having more than one a year. And we've learned a lot about hummingbirds over the past 2 or 3 decades in the state. Not only because, primarily because people tend to put up a lot more feeders these days, because there were some areas of the state that people thought, well, we don't have hummingbirds. Well, we generally have hummingbirds all across the state at times. During migration, sure, central Nebraska has fewer hummingbirds than eastern Nebraska or the Panhandle, but we all can have hummingbirds. But identification, people have got much more adept at identifying hummingbirds. The state of knowledge has improved dramatically there. So it may be a little harder to tease apart, are we just getting better observing, or are there some things going on? But there are some things going on. With Anna's hummingbirds, this is a species that is increasing in its range, and an Anna's hummingbird to come to Nebraska has to go a long ways. But Anna's hummingbirds are increasing in places like Arizona. And on this map, the red shows, this is eBird data, but the red shows areas where species are declining, and the blue shows areas where they've shown an increase. So Anna's hummingbirds have increased pretty dramatically in the Pacific Northwest, helped by humans, not just feeders, but also eucalyptus trees. Apparently they do very well. And it really kind of gets them through the winter. There may also be a climate change angle here with a bird being able to extend its range further north. We're probably never going to see, I shouldn't say never, but I don't think we'll see Anna's hummingbirds nesting in Nebraska. But again, they're undergoing some pretty dramatic changes. Another hummingbird, though, that we may see breeding in the state before long is the black-chinned hummingbird. And if you thought Anna's is doing a lot, the black-chin story is maybe even more dramatic. We had our first state record just a little over a decade ago. And by the end of last year, we now have 33 records. So a pretty dramatic increase. And, here's the kind of the old range of the black-chin hummingbird, pretty much restricted to the far west and southwest, making it to southwest Colorado and New Mexico and kind of the Edwards Plateau area of Texas. And here's this map. It's a little busy to follow, but you can see those blue areas at the eastern edge and the northern parts of its range really expanding, but you're also seeing a decrease in southern areas. But overall, black-chin hummingbirds have increased by over 50% over the last 50 years. And you see kind of what implications for our state is along the front range of Colorado, where there's been a substantial increase. And if you talk to birders out there, we didn't see black-chin hummingbirds years ago, but now they're all over the place. And that's what's fueling the increase in our state. Again, that's probably going to continue, and it wouldn't surprise me that in a few years we have black-chin hummingbirds nesting in the Panhandle. It's possible they could have nested already. The downside of this is with shifting ranges is that black-chin hummingbirds have actually began to hybridize with ruby-throated hummingbirds in Oklahoma and Texas. While some hummingbirds are increasing in North America, others are doing much worse. Allen's, rufous, broadtail have all shown decline. So it's not one direction with hummingbirds. There's changes going on, and some of the declines are pretty serious. And then finally, I just want to mention common raven. because the story with the common raven was, this was a bird that was in our state historically, was probably more or less statewide, and probably actually benefited really a whole lot when the bison herds were being slaughtered because you had a lot of extra food on the ground. But the evidence of its occurrence in Nebraska was very sparse, and we had no solid evidence of its occurrence for over 100 years. We would occasionally have reports, but they were site records, and that's okay, but it was clear a number of those sightings were incorrect. They would often be visiting birders that would see a crow and report a raven. And so we just didn't have that firm evidence that this species was occurring in the state, even though some of those reports were somewhat convincing. But in 2021, the dam broke, and there were a number of reports from Sioux County. That kind of continued in 2021, and this probably represents kind of the reoccupation of certain parts of Nebraska by the common raven. We'll probably never see common ravens around Lincoln, but western Nebraska, maybe parts of the Sandhills, some of those remote areas, ravens may end up being permanent residents of very low density in some of those areas. So common ravens were the big story in 2021, and again, their story is kind of just at the beginning as well. But we're talking about some rare birds, but as populations change and they continue to increase, you sort of become yesterday's news for some of these birds. White-winged dove, I think we had our first record in 97. That sounds right. Now this species, it can be found pretty easily in the southwestern U.S. or southwestern Nebraska, and even in Lincoln, someone will report one in a yard every once in a while. They'll be hanging around there, and this species can pretty much appear anywhere and actually nest anywhere anymore, and it's just going to only continue to increase. So a birding friend of mine who made the trip, I won't mention their name, but when the first one showed up, it was out in Scotts Bluff. He drove all the way out there to see it so he could add it to his state list. And I think he said to me a while ago that I drove 7 hours to see the first one, and now I wouldn't drive 5 blocks to go see one. So, but it just they're still a cool bird. Not knocking the bird, but just how once you become sort of commonplace, you're not the celebrity anymore. And lesser blackback gull, I drove when I was in college at Kearney. We had our first record in '92, and it was actually at Pawnee Lake, and I actually drove from Kearney to Pawnee Lake to see that bird. Now it's a regular bird. We can see multiple, it's still kind of a decent bird, but every spring and fall and winter really it's reported annually, and even in the summer, like at places like Lake McConaughey, there may be a few lesser blackback gulls hanging around anymore. So gulls do very well around human habitation, so there's no. And even doves do. They're generalists. So both of these birds do very well with human alterations in the environment. So that's kind of it for me. Again, my point is just kind of, looking at Nebraska State Bird List and focusing on rare birds. And that point that there's often more to the story. When we're seeing like a rare bird show up in the state for the first time, there's usually something fueling that. And then also too, sometimes it's worthwhile to go into the historical record and challenge some of those conclusions that have been perpetuated for a period of time. I feel it's important for me to state that every bird I talked about tonight are ones that are increasing, and when a bird shows up that hasn't been somewhere, it's easy to take notice. But there's also a number of birds that are declining, and it's much more challenging to know when birds are slowly declining somewhere. It's just the story doesn't have the same, or it's much more challenging to perceive. And again, the story doesn't have the same ring to it, even though it's certainly occurring. And I think the broader message here is that, as we all know, our bird life in the state and elsewhere is changing constantly, and that's what makes being interested in birds so interesting. So that's all I have. I will thank these people again. Ross and Steve helped on the Barnacle Goose project. A number of people helped as well with input on that. the Wildlife Conservation Fund, it is tax season, so you know that you have the opportunity to help out. We did use funds from the Wildlife Conservation to support our stable isotope analysis, which was only $100, so it wasn't like we spent the entire fund on this one project. I think it was a pretty good use of dollars. So thank you very much, and if you have any questions, I'm happy to address them.
Thank you, Joel. We'll get a microphone. If anybody has a question, we'll get a microphone. Landon's got a microphone, I've got one here. So we'll get you on so people at home can hear the question. So go ahead.
Can those hybrid species reproduce?
Some hybrids can, but I don't think there's any evidence that the barnacle goose, cackling goose hybrid can reproduce. So I don't think there's any evidence. I think it's a one and done. They probably have a competitive disadvantage, and you know, there might be a second generation, but it slowly peters out. So usually if they're breeding regularly, it sort of shows up in the biology, the birds, you know, and then we have to question whether those are actually two different species. So.
Other questions?
You said that, if I understood right, that ravens were thought to be here, and you mentioned the bison, but then no records for 100 years. What happened to them?
Well, you know, ravens were persecuted pretty badly throughout much of the late 1800s and 20th century. And I think that also took them some time to adjust to some of the broad-scale changes in habitat. And you never know when there could be some competitive issues with other species that are moved. It seemed like when settlement occurred, the bison left, they retreated to the mountains and the north woods. And it just took them some time to adjust because ravens are not only slowly increasing like now in western Nebraska, but in the eastern U.S. they're also increasing. But it just maybe took them some time to adapt. Yep.
Okay, thank you.
Joel, I spent most of my birding career in Texas, and I've seen expansion of species like Mississippi kite from the late 1980s onward, now spotted in Lincoln in my neighborhood last year. What's on the horizon? What species do you expect to see here soon that you haven't? What should we watch for?
Well, I don't know if I mean, the Mississippi kite is a really good example, and that's one that's going to continue.
Adapted to urban space.
Yep, and you know, that's a bird that, you know, much of the Great Plains was not suitable for it. It's these urban islands. If you drive across, you know, central and western Kansas, you know, during summer, yeah. So you know, that's where they're coming from. Really, I think probably, I don't know, any species we should be on the lookout here doesn't really come to mind. It's more out west. I think the black-chinned hummingbird, and that sort of follows a progression of species. The last decade or so was the lesser goldfinch that was increasing up the Front Range, and you know, but I don't think birds are done expanding. But I can't think of like one that I'm thinking is going to move into the state. There is one, you know, painted bunting has always been one where it's just bizarre that that's a bird that breeds about 50 miles to our south around Tuttle Creek Reservoir. And it's still a very rare bird here. And I don't know if we just need another couple people snooping around far southern Nebraska, you know, that Johnson County area or Gage County, you know, but yeah, no, I think people would not get too upset if they had more painted buntings in their lives. So,
Jason?
First, thank you, Joel, for disproving my crazy conspiracy theory that there's this crazy cabal of tourism people who are grabbing birds from other places, taking them to their state and dropping them off, because that's probably not what's happening. But it seems like it sometimes, right? Those spotted rails and crakes that show up where they shouldn't be.
Well, and that can happen at times too. I mean, I think you know, there were some Abert's towhees that appeared in Minnesota, and you know, that's a non-migratory species in southeast Arizona, and that is something that I think people can consider, because sometimes people do get crazy and trap a bird and think they're going to make it a pet. So I don't know if that, your conspiracy theory may still have some fuel to it.
Okay,
So
good.
I don't think you should put it to bed entirely.
So question though is snail kites? So if limpkins moved and there's a food for them, is that a possibility? Like,
I think that's beyond, I don't know enough about snail kites to know if they would follow suit. But I think
snail kites in Nebraska.
I think it's an interesting question whether if there's a suitable food resource that has expanded beyond its range in Florida, they may never reach Nebraska, but whether they'll expand out, move to Louisiana or anything. So
We'd get a lot more visitors at Spring Creek if
Yeah.
we could get a snail kite.
Any other questions? Nope, got one back here.
Well, I was curious of the mechanism or the strategy. Can't call it a strategy for a snail to make its way up here, or but they don't advertise themselves. So how does the limpkin know? Do they just roost and then try the next drainage over the next night and keep working their way north, or what's the deal?
it may be. They don't entirely eat snails. It's a major part of. They can also eat mollusks. And other. Their snails are kind of their go-to thing. But But I think you described it pretty well. I don't know what these limpkins would be doing if there weren't other snails around, and they may just continue to bounce around until they find enough food or they die. Sometimes dispersing animals disperse somewhere where they shouldn't be, and that's the end of them. But it is an interesting dynamic with these Chinese mystery snails at our latitude, that you do have places where the limpkins can find them and be very happy. So, and I don't know enough about the dynamic on the Gulf Coast to know how the patches of habitat and food availability might have fueled that move west. Obviously, there's a lot more marshy, swampy habitat in Louisiana, and not so much in Alabama and Mississippi areas of the Gulf Coast. So I don't know enough about that expansion to really comment on it. So I just find it fascinating.
Actually, I have a question. Are there any birds that the West Nile virus affected that have not recovered?
Yes. I think the biggest one that comes to mind is black-billed magpie. We had black-billed magpies, on the doorstep of Lincoln. You could go out to Branch Oak Lake and see black-billed magpies up around Ceresco. Their range is pretty much collapsed over, 3/4, 7/8 of their former range in the state. So they're pretty much restricted to the Pine Ridge, the Wildcat Hills, a little bit on the North Platte River Valley and South Platte River Valley into McConaughey, maybe a little bit in southwestern Nebraska, and then there are some pockets, interestingly, in northeastern Nebraska. And, Steve Brenner and I actually wrote a paper about using Christmas bird count data about their decline in the Great Plains. And it is most dramatic in sort of the south central Great Plains, which makes sense. Chickadees, I don't think they're entirely back yet. They've come a long way. I think a lot of us in this room can remember, when West Nile first hit, we were used to going out into the woods or a park or even your yard, and you'd hear chickadees. And then after West Nile virus hit, the silence was sort of bizarre. And it's taken a long, long time for them to recover. But if we look at the data, and I know some people in this room contribute to CBCs, that's one useful thing about CBCs, is showing that chickadees and some other things are recovering. While you mentioned that, I will, completely unrelated to West Nile, but I think bluebirds in particular, and maybe some other semi-hardy species, but bluebirds in particular really got hammered 2 years ago by that terrible cold snap we had about this time of year in February, where the power grid was potentially going to go out. We had a lot of snow on the ground. And talking to a lot of other people in the state, and like Steve Eno with Bluebirds Across Nebraska, I mean, it's just, and I think it's going to take a while before bluebirds recover. So that wasn't your question, but that was just sort of something at the top of my mind. So,
Joel, I want to add a little bit more on the chickadees. I was the compiler for the Christmas bird count, the Christmas after the West Nile, and we only had 25 chickadees on our whole Christmas bird count. I'm guessing it was about 300 and some this year. I don't know for sure, but I mean, it was just stark. It was so sobering.
yeah.
Can I ask a question? This is going to sound really ridiculous, but hummingbirds, do they migrate kind of like the other bird? I always think of hummingbirds as flying lower, and then when you see them above the trees, I'm just astounded. And like when the cranes come in, some years it's not just the cranes, there's other birds kind of coming in with them at the same time.
Yeah, I don't know a whole lot about hummingbird migration, but I do know that typically they're diurnal migrants. They leave. I mean, if you have feeders and you get the north wind, you're going to have hummingbirds for a little while in the morning, and then they're going to disappear. And so they probably migrate for a while and then find some place to refuel after a certain amount of time. So they're not a bird that's obviously equipped to put on a load of fat like some other birds and migrate 24 hours or anything. But I think it's an interesting dynamic to watch if you have a feeder up, and to watch the weather pattern and just how the hummingbirds follow that weather pattern, especially in fall when you have a north wind and they begin to clear out at times. And then you have a new batch come in, later on.
I wish I could see them more often.
Any other questions? Oh, we got one up front here, just a second. There you go.
Yeah, I just wondered, would you explain the history of the house finch in Nebraska, just in case
Sure.
People don't know?
Sure, yeah. If people don't know the history of the house finch, it's the thumbnail version, the brief history of the house finch is, I think it was in the 1930s. Some were released in New York City, and it's a western species originally, to the western U.S., the mountainous areas. So probably historically was in the far western part, maybe the Wildcat Hills area, Pine Ridge sort of. But that population that was introduced in the eastern U.S. began to expand pretty quickly, occupying areas in the eastern U.S. and began to move westward. However, the population in the west, the native population, also began to expand east. Again, this was another species that benefited from human changes to the environment. And what's interesting about where we are right now is I was in the high school at the time, and I remember when house finches first appeared in our backyard in Blair. But we were kind of right at the place where the two populations met. So it's probably hard to discern what got here first, if it was eastern birds or western birds, but we are right on the spot kind of where those two populations came together, and now they're statewide birds. And they're ones that numbers fluctuate, and they can be a concern because they get the conjunctivitis, but it doesn't seem to really hammer their numbers too much. But it does appear that house finches aren't as numerous, at least from my perception, as they once were when they first sort of arrived. And that sort of kind of follows the way of invasions or range expansions. There's lots of birds during the invasion, but then they sort of fall back to some level of equilibrium as sort of the rest of the environment and the bird species adjust to sort of this new guy on the block. So.
Okay, well, let's thank Joel. I have a few more announcements, but thank you, Joel. Let's thank Joel for being here tonight. Doug Campbell, one of our board members, has an issue, so I'm going to hand the microphone off to Doug, and he can let you know about that issue.
Don't worry, I'm not going to read all this paper. On the North Slope in Alaska, ConocoPhillips, I'll give you the title of this project, ConocoPhillips Alaska Willow Project. And this is the northeast corner of Alaska. And
environmental groups and conservation groups across the country are extremely upset about this because this is an area, and I'm going to give you a couple quotes. Willow is a cartoon bomb, a carbon bomb, excuse me, that cannot be allowed to explode in the Arctic. Our native villages are eroding into the seed. Thawing permafrost is making infrastructure insecure, and food sources are disappearing. And this project would just exacerbate and speed up the catastrophe in the Arctic. So I have one more brief quote here. The mayor of the native village, which would be 30-some miles from this project, said that this would invade the habitat of several species of wildlife, including whales, polar bears, migratory birds, and more than 80,000 caribou. So what I did is I made copies of these comments, and I made it real easy. I've got the email addresses for the president, the secretary of the interior, and the director of Bureau of Land Management. And all you have to do is sit down in front of your computer and tap out a message after you read some of this information. And I really would urge you to do so. I know Marilyn McNabb and I talked about this. I think letters from all of us would have a much greater impact than one letter from the Wachiska group. So thank you.
Thank you, Doug. And I'm going to just talk just real briefly just about a couple legislative bills. Yesterday there was a bill, LB 400, in front of the legislature called the Pheasant Protection Act, and it was to put a bounty on red fox, coyotes, possums, striped skunks, and it would give a $10 bounty up to 50,000 critters taken, and it's to get rid of nest predators. Luckily, the hearing yesterday was a lot of the biologists came out and said that this is the thoughts from the 1800s, or the 1920s. This is not what we do today to limit predators. But anyway, LB 400, we hope it doesn't get out of committee. Today there was a crazy bill. Senator Erdman was advocating to move the headquarters from Game and Parks to Sydney. He said because they have all those buildings out there from Cabela's, and so he was going to try to use that as an economic argument, but it's really, he has a burr under his saddle for Game and Parks. Today there was a depredation permit on elk and mountain lions in front of the Natural Resources Committee. But next Monday, I just wanted to mention 814 is a bill in front of appropriations. It's one of the 5 or 6 main appropriations bills, so it's going to get passed, but there's a provision in there we're hoping to maybe stop, and that is to take $14 million from the Environmental Trust and directly give it to the Department of Natural Resources. Not make them apply for a grant like they do now, just give them $14 million from the Environmental Trust. So that's 814 next week. We will be writing a letter from Wachiska, submitting that for testimony, but will be a mainline appropriations bill. They've got like 5 or 6 bills that day, so it's going to be a crazy day, but we are going to get our comments in. I think it's unconstitutional. They're not allowed to give away trust fund money without going through the grant process, but of course when you control the governor and the attorney general and the Senate down there, it's pretty tough to fight the system. But anyway, we're hoping to do that. But there's several other bills if you want to know where Wachiska is at, or Audubon, Nebraska. Wachiska Board hasn't met yet to go over the bills, but we have sent a couple comment letters in on a few bills, and we've got a few more going in. But get a hold of me if you have questions about any legislation. I've been following everything, watching a lot of hearings the last few days, but there's some crazy things out there, but those are a couple of the ones that we're really watching. A lot on weatherization, and of course that comes back to the carbon problems, and so we're watching some of those energy bills. There's also some legislation that's coming up trying to ban ESG, environmentally conscious funding. There's a big push. Some of the far-right folks in the state and across the country are pushing some agendas trying to make sure that green investing is not something that states have to look at, that it wouldn't be allowed in Nebraska if one of the bills that's up now would come to fruition. But anyway, there's a lot of things out there. So if you have a question about what State Audubon or Wachiska is looking at, give me a call and we'll get you a list. I've got a 3-page list that I'll be handing out to the board here next week of bills that I'm following for Wachiska. So there's a lot of things going on, but if you have any questions about anything, let me know. If you want to know how to write a letter, now you have to submit a letter 24 hours. You have to be by noon the day before the hearing, and it has to be submitted online. If you send a letter in It doesn't do any good. You can send a letter to your senator or any senator, but it's not going to have much impact. So you've got to get those in ahead of time by noon the day before the hearing. And if the hearing's on Monday, like this 814 is, it has to be in by Friday at noon. So keep that in mind. It has to be done online through their system or go and testify personally. So anyway, with that, we'll adjourn for the evening. Thanks for coming tonight. Don't forget we've got treats out there, tea and coffee and hot cider. And thanks for coming.